Here we are for our 19th session, looking at the Gospel of Luke in a series we've entitled The Saviour of the World. And we're listening to the story as God told it through Luke so that we might better understand the message of the good news of Jesus that he shares with us in the way that he shares it. So as always, feel free to ask questions. I'm not aware of any questions that might have been left over from last week, but if there are any, I'm sure I'll get to hear of them. And of course, you can do that in the chat window. We'll open things up at the end. You by now know the score. So last week, we looked at three stories that Jesus told. We firstly considered the setting in which they're found, in which Luke very deliberately emphasizes the contrast between the tax collectors and sinners whom Jesus welcomes, and of course with whom he eats and drinks. And these are contrasted with the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious people who grumble and who criticize Jesus. And then we very briefly considered the short stories of the lost sheep and the lost coin before moving on to the main feature, which is, of course, the story of the lost son, probably best described as the story of the compassionate father, as he's really the main point in all of this. The religious people just didn't get God. They just didn't understand what he was really like. And the tragedy is that many people today see God in the way in which many religious people portray him to be, which is certainly not the way in which the scriptures have revealed him to be. Well, this session, this evening, we're going to be looking at a couple of parables which address matters of money and justice, along with various other teachings which don't always appear to be particularly related, but we'll see how everything fits together. So our outline for this evening looks rather like this. If we can move on, there we go. Our outline for this session, we'll look at the story of the shrewd manager. We'll look at the permanence of God's law and how that fits in with these teachings, the rich man and Lazarus, and we'll look a little at lessons of sin, faith, and service. So let's begin with the story of the shrewd manager. A couple of observations before we read through the text here. The previous parables were told primarily to the Pharisees and the scribes. This parable is directed towards the disciples. Beyond that, we know nothing of its context. And we might also say that this is arguably the most difficult to understand of the parables recorded by Luke. The main difficulty is that Jesus appears to be commending a servant for his dishonesty, or is he? Well, let's read it together. He also said to the disciples, "There was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. So he called him and said to him, 'What is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager.' Well, the manager said to himself, 'What shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I've decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, "How much do you owe my master?" And he said, 100 measures of oil. So he said to him, "Take your bill, sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, "How much do you owe?" And he said, 100 measures of wheat. Well, he said to him, "Take your bill and write 80. Well, the master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings." Well, what a story is that? And I suppose it's probably not one of the most popular stories that Jesus told, probably not one of the best known, other than for it being probably the most difficult, or at least certainly among those recorded by Luke. Let's briefly look firstly at the characters that we find here. There is firstly a rich man. Now, we have no idea who he was, but he introduces a theme which runs through this whole chapter. Then we come across a manager. He's, sorry, I meant to put that up. There we go. No idea who he was. Introduces a theme running through the whole chapter. Then we find we're introduced to a manager. Now, this word is somewhat ambiguous. It's often translated as steward, and it's often used of a slave who was put in charge of a master's estate. But in this case, he appears to be a free man. Not a freed man necessarily, but a man who was free, who was not enslaved to this rich man. But then, of course, this is only a story, so we don't need to be overly concerned with such things. The other characters are the master's debtors, or his creditors, and we're not told how they came to owe their debts to the master. Maybe they had borrowed from him. We're just not told. What we are told is what the debts were. There were 100 measures of oil, and that's supposedly approximately 800 gallons, which one writer suggests is the yield from about 150 olive trees. I must confess, I've seen olive trees, but I've never picked many olives from them, and I've certainly never trodden upon them in order to extract the oil. So you probably know better than I do of such things. And then the 100 measures of wheat, well, that's approximately 1,000 bushels, which is the yield from about 100 acres of wheat. So these are not insignificant amounts which are owed to the rich man. Well, the story goes along the following lines. Charges were brought to the rich man that this manager, this steward, was wasting his possessions. Now, incidentally, this is the same word as was used of the lost son who squandered his property in reckless living. Here, the manager was wasting his master's possessions. So there's kind of a little link, if you want, between the previous story and this one. And the link is of wastefulness, or of squandering I suppose you could say this chap was a prodigal manager, but maybe not. Anyway, neither of them were being particularly responsible. In fact, they were both being rather irresponsible. And this manager was presumably misappropriating his master's property, his finances, presumably for his own personal gain. Evidently, the rich man was satisfied that the allegations were well-founded, because the next thing we read is that this manager is being dismissed. And I suppose there was no means of appeal or anything like that, and no union that he had joined to represent him or what have you. He's told that he's fired, and fired he was. The final act of management that he was to enact was to turn in the final accounts. And then he says to himself, what shall I do, since my master's taking the management away from me? Not strong enough to dig, ashamed to beg. And then he, recognizing that his options are limited, it seems that an idea comes to him all of a sudden. It's like, I've got it. I know what I'm going to do when I'm removed from management, in order that people may receive me into their houses. He is a rather shrewd fellow, isn't he? A pretty clever chap. Even though he has been dishonest. Now, it's important to understand that his motive is not to seek any sort of revenge. His only concern here is about safeguarding his future. How could he be sure that he was going to be okay now that he's been fired, he's been removed from his position of management? So in dealing with his creditors, his master's creditors, one at a time, he seems to be acting in a deliberately secretive fashion. One by one, he instructs them to rewrite their debts, giving each of them a rather substantial discount. What on earth is going on? Well, there seem to be three possibilities. I mean, I suppose there may be a plethora of possibilities, but there seem to be three which might be remotely credible. The first is that the manager simply lowers the debt, essentially cheating his master. That seems to be one possibility. And I think that's probably the possibility that immediately comes to mind, but it's not necessarily what happens. A second possibility is that the manager removes the interest from the debt, reducing the amount owed back to the original level of the debt. Now, this is a rather interesting possibility, because you may very well know that Torah forbade the charging of interest. So if this is what was happening, well, it shouldn't have been happening in the first place. We throw up a few quotes from Torah. Here's one from Exodus chapter 22. If you lend money to any of my people with you who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. Now, if any of us have ever set about trying to secure a loan, you'll know that the people from whom you borrow the money probably want to get more back at the end of the day. I mean, that, after all, is how they make their money. That's how money lenders get by in life. And the less sort of scrupulous they are, the more greedy they are, or the more willing they might be to take risks, the more interest you're going to end up paying. That's the way that it goes. There's another useful passage here in the book of Leviticus, where God says that if your brother becomes poor and cannot maintain himself with you, you shall support him as though he were a stranger and a sojourner, and he shall live with you. Take no interest from him or profit, but fear your God, that your brother may live beside you. You shall not lend him your money at interest, nor give him your food for profit. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan and to be your God. And he might as well have added, oops, pardon me, let me stop this. There we go. We got rid of that. So he might well have added to that that when God gave to you the land of Canaan, he oh gosh, get rid of that one as well. There we go. He might well have added. I'm sorry, I'd muted my phone here, but I hadn't. I had another one here, and there we go. So. Well, that's it. We've got rid of those. Right, where were we? Yes, he might well have added here to this this statement, having said, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt to give you the land of Canaan." And to be your God, he might well have added that I did so without charging you any interest. And so that's why they were not to do anything of the sort. God was always only generous to his people. And so they were to be generous to those among them who were in need. Both of those quotes, the one from Exodus, this one from Leviticus, speaks of those who were poor and who were in need of help. And then in Deuteronomy 23, he says, you shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest. So that was the teaching of Torah. There was certainly a prohibition on charging interest for any who were poor, and there's a general blanket no interest policy, except of course if you're lending to a foreigner. That's how it went. But along with the law, there were, of course, loopholes which were often employed. The reasoning given was that the law was concerned with the exploitation of the poor, whereas other loans might be seen as more business transactions, in which the payment of interest was seen as sort of a means of sharing the profits. At least that's how they got around these sort of things. And if this is what was going on here, well, if it was that the manager simply removed the interest from the amounts that were owed, then of course it would be very difficult for the rich man to find fault with his manager for taking that sort of action, because, well, he shouldn't have been charging interest in the first place. So that's another possibility of what might have been going on. But there's a third possibility, and that is that the manager removes his own commission, so the master still receives what is due to him, whilst the manager himself goes without in the short term. Now, of course, this is only a story, although it only makes sense that those who first heard it would have been able to understand what was going on. And I'm a little undecided between the second and third possibility, although I favor the third, in as much as the manager is commended for his shrewdness, not for his righteousness or goodness or lawfulness. Yeah, he's commended for his shrewdness. I think what he's doing is probably simply removing his own commission that he would have charged. The master still gets what is due to him, but the manager himself goes without in the short term, but in order to benefit from the long-term investment that he's making in these creditors who would see him as being their friend and would, of course, open up their homes to him were he to find himself in need. Now, at some point, the manager realizes what is going on, and he commends the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. Well, why is he spoken of as a dishonest manager? Is this due to his mismanagement of the master's business, or is this due to his act in reducing the debts? I suspect the former. Or else it would seem that the master commended him for his dishonesty. I don't think he's doing that. I think he's simply spoken of here as a dishonest manager because that's what he had been. That's why he was being fired in the first place. And that's what led the manager to demonstrate his shrewdness, his cleverness in the situation in which he finds himself. So the whole purpose of this story is seen by the concluding remarks of Jesus. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. Jesus implies that those of this world may generally be more careful with how they use their resources, and this may be because they are more concerned with the matters of this world. And I'm sure that we've possibly observed that from our own experiences, that there are those whom we know of this world who are far more careful with their money than we might be, far more careful with their possessions even than we might be. Well, there are lessons that we might be able to learn from them. Because in contrast, the sons of light may sometimes be less careful with such things. And Jesus then goes on to say, I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. This is a little more tricky, I think. Make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth. Some versions don't have unrighteous. I think some have dishonest. Others, I think, simply use the word worldly wealth. Unrighteous wealth is really what's being said here. But this phrase, unrighteous wealth, does not necessarily mean that money or wealth is inherently evil, but that it is often associated with things which are. And in that sense, it may be somewhat similar to Paul saying, when he spoke of the love of money being the root of all kinds of evil. Money itself isn't unrighteous, isn't itself evil, but it is very often associated with things which are. And so to make friends for yourselves seems to convey the idea of using our resources in such a way that benefits those around us. And therefore wins their appreciation. And that's just what this shrewd manager had done. He had, played his cards rather cleverly. He had used the things of this world, the money, the material matters at hand. He had used them and worked with them in such a way that had made friends with those whose debts he had reduced. And I think he's reduced their debts at his own expense, at his own short-term loss, not necessarily through any dishonest means. For the master commends him for his shrewdness. Now, the reason given for doing this is that when it fails, that is, when the unrighteous wealth fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Well, the idea of eternal dwellings must surely refer to our heavenly residence, if you like. And so the idea seems to be something similar to the idea of storing our treasure in heaven. But who are the they that will welcome us? Are they those who have benefited from our generosity, or are they angelic beings, or maybe God himself, using the royal we, as it were? Well, the general message here has to do with acting in the present in order to secure a better future. In light of this, it seems that the whole parable is intended to make us aware that our actions in this life will have a direct consequence in the life beyond. And so I think that they who will welcome us are going to be the angelic beings, or God himself, or God and the angelic beings, if you like, who will welcome us into our heavenly abode. And will do so because we have been shrewd, we've been wise with the resources which God has given us. We have, if you like, stored them in heaven. We've not used them selfishly. We've not used them purely for our own benefit, but we have sought to benefit others with the things that God has given to us. And all of this seems to be borne out by the teaching which follows, and which emphasizes our need to be faithful and trustworthy in our devotion towards God himself. For Jesus continues by saying that one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much. And one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have if then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you to the true riches? And if you've not been faithful in that which is another's, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he'll hate the one and love the other, or he'll be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Now, I understand that it's sometimes a little tricky with some of these phrases to fit in there, this shrewd manager, because he was dishonest. And so, of course, we are not to be dishonest in any way. He says here, quite simple, that the one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. But he's certainly not being commended for his dishonesty, but for his shrewdness. And our shrewdness is certainly to be borne out by our honesty before God and our proper dealings with the things that are of this world. Well, we may want to pursue some of those matters a little bit later. I want to press on here through the text for now as we come to the next section, which is addressed primarily to the Pharisees who were lovers of money. Well, that being said, and it is said here by Luke, that being said, no mention is made of money in these teachings which are recorded here. And this makes this a rather perplexing passage, but I think that there is a link. I think the link lies in the fact that God knows your hearts. Jesus has just spoken about the impossibility of divided loyalties, and this seems to be key to understanding the train of thought that is going on here. The Pharisees ridiculed Jesus because in their religious thinking, if you like, righteousness brought material wealth. That was their way of thinking, and it's not an uncommon way of thinking. There are many who think that if you are faithful to God, he will make you rich. Yeah, we've maybe come across people who've thought in that kind of way. Well, the idea of their ridicule has literally the idea they turned their noses up at Jesus. And of course, you know, their thinking is rather common. It's a thinking that has the idea that material wealth is evidence of blessing from above. I think we know better than that, but the Pharisees didn't. Their primary concern was how they appeared before others, and they were typically more concerned with appearing to be righteous in the eyes of men rather than in the eyes of God. But their self-importance was sickening. It was an abomination in the sight of God. And of course, their idea of being self-righteous would have gone along with their idea of appearing wealthy, because if they were wealthy, well, they were obviously righteous in the sight of God because their wealth was a blessing from God, and on and on and on. Well, Jesus continues, and this is a bit of a link in this passage here, that the law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is preached, and everyone forces his way into it. But it's easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. Now, if we're reading through this, and as I'm sure we've read through it in the past, and wondering, you know, where is Jesus going with all of this? How does all of this fit together? I think what's going on here is that with the coming of Jesus, the good news of the kingdom is proclaimed, calling people to a righteousness, which elsewhere we will read as being a righteousness which exceeded that of the religious Pharisees. You know, they thought they were righteous, but their righteousness was only a self-righteousness, which came from their nitpicking obedience to what they saw of the law. But the righteousness of the kingdom is of the heart, and it's a response not to law, but to the love of God. There was no fault with the law. It remains intact. It's fulfilled by us through the Spirit of God. That's what Paul says, beginning of Romans chapter 8. But the fault lay in how it was abused by the religious people who sought to use the law as a means of self-justification. And they saw themselves as being law keepers. They saw themselves as being righteous before God on the basis of law, but they were mistaken. Their righteousness was was only a self-righteousness, a self-importance that God found repulsive, because God looks not on the outward, but upon the heart, and he sees the hearts that are right with him and those that are absolutely not. So Jesus then almost completely randomly introduces this teaching on divorce. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. How does that fit into all of that? Well, at first it does seem rather out of place, and it could be that Luke has simply selected this teaching and placed it here in the flow of things. Well, whether Jesus taught this at this time or Luke places it here, it does seem a little out of place. But Jesus, I think, is using this teaching on marriage to reinforce the importance of commitment before God, something of which the Pharisees knew very little. Where the religious elite sought to complicate matters, and certainly they sought to complicate matters of divorce and remarriage and what have you, where they sought to complicate matters by imposing burdens of additional regulations whilst finding loopholes to avoid actual faithfulness, the law was very simple in its demand for faithfulness and commitment to one's spouse before an ever-faithful God. But those religious people were always out to try to find a loophole, to try to find a way in which they might have got out of the simple, plain teachings of God. And nothing has changed today. I'm sure I won't be surprised if most, if not all of us, have at some point or another come across people who are obsessed with all of the little details of this and that, and marriage and divorce and remarriage is one of their favorite it was certainly one of the favorite subjects of the Pharisees. And it's not that these things are not important, they are, but they're important even in their simplicity. That marriage is a lifelong commitment between two people in the sight of God. Well, we really must move on, for time is not on our side. And I very much want us to move on through the text here, to look at this story that Jesus tells of a rich man and a poor man. There was a rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. Now, we've got to understand that those are status symbols. The purple clothing, the fine linen, the sumptuous feasting are all social statuses. If Jesus had been telling this story today, then he would have had, he would have had the finest technology. He'd have driven an Aston Martin, and you get the idea, okay? But those things were not in plentiful supply back in the first century in which Jesus lived. So here's this rich man. At his gate was laid a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who desired to be fed with what fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, even the dogs came and licked his sores. The poor man died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's side. And the rich man also died. That's about the first thing so far that they've had in common. The rich man also died and was buried, and in Hades, being in torment, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham far off and Lazarus at his side. And he called out, Father Abraham, have mercy on me. Send Lazarus to dip the end of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. But Abraham said, Child, remember that you in your lifetime received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in anguish, as if he hadn't already got that. And besides all this, between us and you, a great chasm has been fixed, in order that those who would pass from here to you may not be able, and none may cross from there to us. And so the rich man says, I beg you, Father, to send him to my father's house, for my 5 brothers, so that he may warn them, lest they also come into this place of torment. But Abraham said, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. And he said to them, look, if they don't hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced if someone should rise from the dead. Often spoken of as a parable, it's really a picture story of reality, although, of course, it's painted in many colorful words. But it's a picture of 2 contrasting characters and their vastly contrasting circumstances. I mean, it really is a terribly good story, isn't it? The rich man is not named. The poor man is called Lazarus. In fact, he's the only named character in any of the stories that Jesus told. It's a fairly common name. It's derived from the name Eleazar, meaning God helps. And there's no reason at all to associate him with Lazarus of Bethany, the brother of Mary and Martha. So there's Lazarus, the poor man, and there's the rich man. Well, to the Pharisee, it must have seemed, as Jesus began to tell this story, to the Pharisee, it must have seemed that the rich man, he was the righteous one. I mean, his riches were surely evidence of his righteousness. I mean, that's why they had mocked and ridiculed Jesus, because he thought that somehow there was, something to be said for those who were poor. Well, as far as the Pharisees were concerned, there was nothing to be said for those who were poor. Little could have been further from the truth. And as Jesus continued telling this story, just rather like as Jesus continued telling that story of that Samaritan, you remember, and the fellow who'd been beaten up, and there is a twist, and it's a very big twist that comes in this story. The rich man in his lifetime received good things, Lazarus bad things, but now he's the one who is being comforted there at Abraham's side. But he, the rich man, he's the one who's now in anguish. So yet again, we're reminded that God does not see things as we very often see them. Well, there's an awful lot that could be said of this story, but here are some thoughts that may be helpful at this point. Firstly, the story has little to do with physical circumstances. It has everything to do with the state of our hearts and ultimately with our spiritual circumstances, of course. One's status in this life has nothing whatsoever to do with our status in life beyond this life. Jesus is never concerned with our level of wealth, but he's always concerned with the state of our hearts. We might say it matters not what we have got, it only matters what has got us. And You know, the problem with the rich man, I mean, had the rich man been shrewd like the dishonest manager in the earlier story, had he have been shrewd, he may well have been received into the eternal dwellings along with Lazarus, but he wasn't. Instead, he used his wealth and resources only selfishly. That was the problem, not that he was rich, but that he used his riches and his resources selfishly, only for his own benefit, not for the benefit of others. How could he not have had compassion upon this poor man who was covered in sores? How could he not have had compassion on him? Well, because his heart knew nothing of the kingdom of God. It would seem that maybe the only redeeming feature of this rich man's character is his concern for his 5 brothers, but his concern was misjudged and his concern was far too late. If the word of God cannot convince a man of his need to turn to God, no miracle will make one bit of difference. A heart that is disinclined towards God will not be moved. And that became abundantly clear, did it not, when one was raised from the dead? When the religious people knew of the resurrection of Jesus, and we can be in no doubt that they knew full well what had happened, it made not one little bit of difference, for their hearts were not one little bit inclined towards God. Well, the final bit, and we're moving on to the final furlong, as it were, although there is so much that we could say, is there not, of this story of the rich man and the poor man called Lazarus, so much that could be said of it. One other thing that perhaps we ought to say is that Jesus is painting a picture story. You know, he's not saying that this is exactly how it is, because he's describing spiritual realities by the use of physical pictures. I mean, just think for one moment, if all of the righteous were by the side of Abraham, Abraham would have to be a pretty big chap. You know, I mean, this is he's painting a true picture of spiritual reality, but using these, you know, physical images, as it were. But this idea of the chasm, is there really a fixed chasm? Well, no, not in the physical sense that we might imagine, but spiritually, yes, there is. Beyond this life, there is no toing and froing as far as our eternal destiny is concerned. If we do not enter our eternal residence, well, maybe we should say we will enter our eternal residence when this life is done, and there'll be no moving house after that point. Our eternal residence will be just that. It'll be our eternal residence. Let's move on to look at this final section very briefly as we just dip our toes into chapter 17. We're only going to look at the first 10 verses, if you like, because verse 11, that's where the chapter division really ought to take place, because yet again, Luke introduces us to some travelings and what have you. And incidentally, I will let you know, yes, I'll let you know now, because I'll probably forget to let you know at the end. And that is simply that I will not be with you for the next 3 weeks. However, the next 2 weeks, I think it is, Jack is going to be taking the Monday night class, again, continuing our journey through the Gospel of Luke. And then John Griffiths, Lord willing, will be with us on the 3rd. I am In fact, as soon as I finish this class, I've got to begin packing for Wednesday, early Wednesday morning. I will be heading on my way to Croatia. Not on holiday, but I'm sure I'll enjoy it. I'm there teaching for a week. So yes, I won't be with you for the next 3 weeks after. I do have a week's family holiday at the end of all of that, if you'll allow me to do such a thing. But they will be picking up the baton, so to speak. But let's just say a little bit about these first 10 verses of chapter 17. It's a short section addressed to the students of Jesus, highlights a number of aspects of discipleship, which seem to focus primarily upon things which cannot be seen, upon matters concerning sin and spiritual realities. I think we've already said earlier on in our journey through Luke that there is considerable focus throughout this whole volume. There's considerable focus on matters of a spiritual nature, sometimes only alluded to in maybe, rather subtle ways. But spiritual truths are to be found over and over and over again. The main points here are that temptations to sin are sure to come, but woe to the one through whom they come. So there is in this opening bit of Luke chapter 17, this idea of our mutual accountability, that we certainly must never be responsible for tripping up another. We should never be responsible for introducing temptation into the lives of our brothers and sisters. No, we should never be responsible for that. For he goes on to say, it'd be better to have a millstone, which is a jolly heavy stone, tied around us and thrown into the sea. Well, the second main point, I think, here is that we are in this whole idea of mutual accountability. We do need to be looking out for each other, not ever with an eye of criticism or condemnation, but only out of care and compassion, so that if your brother or sister sins, rebuke him or her. And of course, then if he, there we go. Oops, what's happening? There we are. If your brother sins, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. If he sins against you 7 times in the day and turns to you 7 times saying, I repent, you must forgive him. So the order of the day here is not condemnation. It is not criticism. It is not fault finding, but if you see your brother sin, if you see him trip up, if you see him in some kind of spiritual trouble, rebuke him. And that doesn't mean to treat each other harshly. It means to make him aware of what it is that's being done. And if he repents, forgive him. And then specifically, the teaching here, yes, Lee has just said rebuke there has as the idea of restoration. And that is the purpose in all of this. We're not out to find fault in each other, but we're out to help each other through life's journey. And life's journey will surely involve trials and temptations. We are to be there to help each other along, certainly not to push each other over as we go. And then he says, if you had faith like a grain of mustard seed, you could say to this mulberry. So here again, that which is barely seen, but he talks of the nature of our faith, the purity of our faith. Unlike that of so many of the religious people whose faith was only evident by the things which they said, ours is to be evident by the lives that we live, the heart that we have towards God. And so pure should it be that, yes, we could say to, I presume there was a mulberry tree standing by, be uprooted and planted in the sea and it would obey you. And no, that doesn't mean to say that God has called us all to be landscape gardeners, but such that our faith is to be genuine, it's to be true, it's to be pure, it's to be unwavering, it's to be certain. And then he'll go on to speak of the role of not just a servant, but a slave, who is simply to do, and this is how we are to be before God. When you have done all that you were commanded, he concludes, say, we are unworthy servants. We've only done what was our duty. Never should we think that God ought to be patting us on the back saying, well, that was a great job that you did there. I mean, he'll do that, but that's not what we should expect. We are unworthy servants. We're only doing what is our duty, and what more could we do in light of all that God has done for us? Well, let's wrap up these. Well, there you go. I've mentioned that earlier. We're pretty much full, but we've got 1 or 2 spaces left. And that brings us to the end of our evening's session. Thank you for being with us.